My name is Kaden Stuckey, and today's date is December 9th, 2022. We're here as part of the Auglaize County Historical Society's In Motion Tourism Project. Today we're interviewing John Zwez. Please introduce yourself and spell your name.
I am John Zwez, Z-W-E-Z. I am the retired director of the Armstrong Air and Space Museum.
Thank you for being here. Please give us some background on your life, including your family and any jobs you've held.
I grew up here in Wapakoneta, and as a young person, I went to St. Paul's United Church of Christ, and that was my first experience of knowing the Armstrongs and Neil Armstrong. And Neil Armstrong's mother and father were close friends with my mother and father, and we would frequently see each other on Sundays when we went to church. As Neil's mother, Viola, was a Sunday school teacher, and I remember that when I was quite young, of going to church and to Sunday school and seeing her there. And that is the very first time that I can remember knowing about Armstrong, the Armstrong family. I was probably 5 or 6 years old at the time, so I started out really young, knowing about the family and the connection to not only my family, but to the city of Wapakoneta.
Your focus in Auglaize County In Motion Project is Neil Armstrong. Please share us your connections with this subject.
I think the very first time that I really knew about Neil Armstrong and his endeavors in aviation and space was my parents, who were friends with the Armstrong family, with Stephen and Viola. We were at a family get-together. Now, I'm not related to the Armstrong family, but through Neil's mother, there was some relationship with my father's family. And I remember we were there one day on a Sunday visiting relatives, which we frequently did. I think that was the thing here in Auglaize County, and maybe other counties also, of visiting relatives on Sundays. And I'll never forget that Viola said to my father, "How's the family doing?" And my father said, "Oh, we're doing fine, and how's your family doing?" And I was probably 9 or 10 at the time this occurred. And Viola said, "Well, I'm a bit concerned about Neil. He has a new job, and he's going out to California to become a test pilot." She said, "That's pretty scary, because that's a really dangerous job." Well, my ears perked up right away, being a 9 or 10-year-old talking about aviation and space and being a test pilot. And after that, I talked a little bit. Of course, a 9 or 10-year-old, I didn't talk that much to older people, because we just didn't do that when we were young. But I found out later that who Neil Armstrong really was going to become. And I was lucky enough years later to get a job at the Neil Armstrong Air and Space Museum. And I was a director there and worked there for almost 34 years in one capacity or another, but have been involved with the museum for over 50 years now. I'm still involved.
Can you tell us what you know about the museum?
Well, it'd probably be easy to tell you what I don't know about the museum, but I started at the museum 2 weeks before it actually opened. At that time, a lot of the displays were not in. I helped to install the displays. I helped Mr. Tom Crouch, who was the gentleman who worked with the Ohio Historical Society. It was called that back in the day. Now it's the Ohio History Connection. I helped him install some of the displays, including one I'll never forget was the Knob and Shoe early aircraft, which was a craft that flew over Toledo, Ohio, kind of a forerunner of the Goodyear blimp. And I helped install those first things. I was there the very first day the museum opened on July 20th. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 1972, 3 years to the day that Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. And it was quite a crazy day. They estimated that over 10,000 people came through. All I can remember is they had told us to be there early, like at 7 o'clock in the morning, even though we didn't know until 2, to make sure everything was good to go. And I don't think I got home until after midnight that night, because there was people still going to the museum at 11 o'clock. So that was kind of the beginning of how I started working at the museum. I took over as director, I believe it was 1973. Prior to that, I was the audiovisual technician and did all the repairs to the audiovisual equipment back then. And worked there all those years. I believe I retired in 2004. Then I was involved with our local organization and now runs the Armstrong Air and Space Museum for the Ohio History Connection. That's the Armstrong Air and Space Museum organization. And we, at this time, are still operating the site for the Ohio History Connection. And so that brings us to today, and I'm still involved. So it's been a quite enjoyable journey over the years, being involved with the Armstrong Air and Space Museum, and personally knowing Mr. Armstrong and his family.
All right. What made you decide to apply to work at the museum?
I made that decision when I was in high school. I was quite interested, although when I was young, interested in aviation and space, and I used to drive my mother nuts because I would go out and crawl on top of the roof to look at the sky, night sky, with a pair of binoculars, and I was always interested in it, can remember that. When I got into high school, I realized when I grew to be 6'5", I would never be an astronaut. And at that time, there was a technical school in Louisville, Kentucky called United Electronics Institute. And their advertisement was, they showed a picture of one of their technicians who was working on the Gemini spacecraft. He was wiring the entire spacecraft. So that piqued my interest, and I went off to technical school in Louisville, Kentucky for a couple years. When I came back, there wasn't a whole lot of jobs, but I knew in my field of electronics, but I knew that the museum was going to be opening soon, so I applied for that position as audiovisual technician, and they hired me. So that was that, and like I said, I worked about a year and a half, 2 years. The director at that time left for another position, and I was hired as the director.
What is your favorite memory of working at the museum?
One of my favorite memories is Neil Armstrong would stop in from time to time, just to stop in to chat or to drop off some type of artifacts or something. And one quiet day in the middle of winter, I think it was in January, there was almost nobody in the building. And Neil stopped in. I heard a knocking on my office door, and here he steps in and dropped a few artifacts off that he was going to donate to the museum, and said, "Hey, you want to take a walk through? I'd like to look at some things again." So Neil and I started walking through, and there wasn't more than 3 or 4 people, maybe 5 people in the building, but there was an elderly couple who happened to be there. And they were kind of walking around behind us, and I heard the gentleman behind us say to his wife, as we were walking out of the theater up there, that "That's Neil Armstrong." She said, "It is not Neil Armstrong. I know what he looks like. It's not Neil." So we're walking, and Neil and I are chatting, and Neil hears the conversation a little bit too, and he's just kind of smiling. We walk around, come back downstairs into my office, and him and I are sitting there chatting. Next thing I know, I see a cane come through my office door, and this gentleman taps on the door with his cane and says, "May I come in?" I said, "Yes, can I help you?" And he looks at Neil and he said, "Are you Neil Armstrong?" And Neil stood up and said, "Yes, I am." And he shook his hands. And the next thing I knew, out of the gentleman's mouth was this yell, and I cannot remember his wife's name, Betty, whatever. "I told you that was Neil Armstrong," and it echoed all the way through the building because there was nobody else there. But that's one of my fondest memories of Neil being there, and it was probably the old guy, it's probably the first time he was ever right around his wife, but that's another story. It was just the way he responded, Neil responded to him was quite interesting.
Who was the most memorable guest at the museum that you remember?
Mickey Rooney. You younger generation probably do not know who Mickey Rooney is, but he was an actor, and he came to the museum one day and went through the gift shop, and I'll never forget the sales clerks, and I walked out and I saw this little person. Now, I'm 6'5", and Mickey Rooney couldn't have been over 4 feet tall. And I had the opportunity to stand out and said hello to him, and I didn't make a big deal over it. It was Mickey Rooney.
So, excuse me, I think we have to just start that story over because
Okay.
we'd never be able to use it with the